Do I come stand by you, Zephyr, or just stay over here? Close this. So airing it out a bit is a bit warm. Yeah.
Okay, welcome everyone to this week's Friday lecture. We have a very special guest today, Professor Mateo Carrillo, who is joining us from Santa Clara University nearby, and we'll be speaking on disparate development, gender geographies, Ejidos, urbanization, and the maquila industry in Ciudad Juárez for today's talk. This is going to be live streamed and will continue to be available to the public on YouTube after the event for anyone who likes replays and wants to watch again. You can also submit questions and comments via YouTube chat. And supposedly I will be able to read them to our speaker during the Q&A session at the end of the talk, trusting that that's going to be possible. Wanted to take a moment here to acknowledge, for those of us at Stanford, we are in the land and territory of the Ohlone original peoples, and we offer gratitude to the land, water, and air that surround us, and pay our respects to the past, present, and future Ohlone and Lenape peoples who continue to be present in their homelands and throughout their diasporas. Very briefly, just to introduce our speaker, Mateo is an assistant professor of Latin American history at Santa Clara. As I just mentioned, he's got a book project, Mexico's Other Revolution, Rural Technology, Environmental Change, and Transnational Migration, which is underway, and it examines the rapid transformation of Mexico's built and natural environments during the 20th century. And having had the pleasure of reading this manuscript in the form of a dissertation here at Stanford, I can attest that it's an innovative, methodologically innovative and conceptually innovative approach to questions of mobility in a transnational context, looking at the way that people imagined their mobilities and talked about, so it's not just about literally how people move, but the kind of roads that they map in their minds and the way that people find out and tell stories about mobility and how that influences their actual lives and their expectations. But then there's also a dimension of this research that focuses on technology itself, and not only the influence of transportation technology, but other technologies such as water and so forth, which influences people's mobility. This work has appeared in journals such as Environmental History and the journal Land. So very proud to introduce Mateo, a graduate of our history department, a PhD from Stanford, who's gone out into the world and is doing wonderful work. And we'll turn things over to you. And I guess, yes, afterwards I'll have some more MC duties to do.
All right.
Please, Mateo, take it away.
Thank you so much, Zephyr, for the kind, very generous introduction. And I'd like to thank Alberto and the staff at Center for Latin American Studies here at Stanford for inviting me to give this talk today, and for all the master's students who are joining us, and some, library staff and other people who have joined us, and for anybody who might be out there and streaming live. Zephyr has introduced me. I'm a professor at Santa Clara University. The name of my talk, as you can see, is on the slide. So really, to just start off, just to make it very clear, my presentation today makes two primary arguments. Okay, one, that post-1960 development in Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, produced patterns of urbanization unique to the northern Mexican borderlands. And two, this unique process informed investment and development trends that shape geographies of inequality and gendered violence in the region. Okay? Importantly, a central factor in the urbanization of Juárez were Ejidos, agrarian collectives distributed and administered by Mexico's federal government after the Mexican Revolution. Now, before the 1990s, ejidos, generally speaking, were agrarian, rural, inalienable lands. They could not be legally sold, rented, privatized. All right? They were property of the state. Not only that, ejidos were cultural icons, celebrated in revolutionary mythology and popular memory. So the question you may have is, how could these intrinsically rural and inalienable communal lands play a vital role in urbanization processes in one of Mexico's most populated and urban metropolitan areas? Moreover, what possible connection could ejido lands have with patterns of gendered violence, femicide, one of Juárez's most notorious social ills? The objective of this talk is to shed light on the urbanization of ejido lands and evolution of ejido land tenure in Juárez, as well as these processes' spatial correlation to poverty and femicide. First, I'd like to take this opportunity to mention that this research is part of the Urban Discontents Project, led in part by our very own Zephyr Frank, Stanford History Department. It's a collaboration with Stanford's Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis, particularly Leonardo Barlita, a postdoc, and Eric Steiner, who furnished many of the maps we will see today. Okay? And also, this was funded in part, this research, by an NSA grant and your very own Center for Latin American Studies here at Stanford. Okay? Thank you for that. Right. So today I'll explore how the urbanization and the evolution of ejido land use inform patterns of investment, poverty, and violence in Juárez. Before I do, I need to provide some context from rural Mexico. Beginning in earnest in 1943, with the Rockefeller Foundation's attempt to industrialize traditional Mexican agriculture and land tenure, U.S. technical assistance programs enthralled Mexican elites, training and recruiting them to promote and often market costly farm technologies manufactured by U.S. companies. The allure of capital and technology-intensive U.S.-style development in Mexico's countryside collided with the reality of centuries of inequality and traditional agrarian cultures. Similar processes played out in other parts of Latin America, as this U.S.-driven rural development regime was exported by U.S. agents around the globe, becoming known as the Green Revolution. In fact, recent works have shown how U.S. aid programs helped privatize Latin American natural resources and decentralize state functions much earlier than the neoliberal turn of the 1990s. Yet, what truly distinguished Mexico during this era of hemispheric rural development was the Bracero program. The Bracero program capitalized on the increase in spatial mobility via new transportation infrastructure spurred by rural development, and decrease in upward mobility occasioned by the shock of the sudden introduction of a radically foreign industrial agricultural regime, one which exacerbated rural land, water, and job loss, land consolidation, and environmental change. Importantly, these factors not only intensified rural migration to the United States, but urbanization in Mexico. Many of these rural migrants flooded Mexico's urban areas, with Juárez also representing a major stopping point on the migration journeys from the Mexican interior. Okay? By 1960, Mexico was a majority urban nation, thanks, in part, to the modernization of rural landscapes. And there's arguably no more Mexican rural landscape, both culturally and legally, than the ejido. So born of the Mexican Revolution, the ejido is the symbol of radical land reform in Mexico. In the ejido system before the 1990s, the state owned all land and waters. Ejidatarios, members of ejidos, possessed usufruct rights to the land. And ejido lands couldn't be legally sold or rented. The ejido system was enshrined in the 1917 Constitution, and grants were often distributed from vast private estates, haciendas, despised symbols of the social and resource inequality that plagued Mexico during the dictatorship of Porfirio Díaz. You can see on this slide that in 2019, Chihuahuan landscapes were still dominated by ejidos. The ejido system, radical in theory, had a fatal flaw in practice, as Ejidal scholars such as Emilio Corri have pointed out. Created by revolutionary political elites, it was based on their preconceptions of rural Mexicans and an imagined indigenous past, a sort of one-size-fits-all solution for a very ethnically and culturally diverse rural population and an extremely complex set of social problems. As the 20th century progressed, the agrarian rural Ejidal increasingly abutted or was incorporated into Mexico's expanding urban spaces. Their unique legal disposition and cultural significance didn't protect them from Mexico's weak legal institutions or the ambitions of a political and economic oligarchy closely associated with the dominant post-revolutionary ruling party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or it's known more commonly as the PRI. Okay, before we get any further, I want to provide you a quick description of this paper's methods. To examine the evolution of Ejidal land use, urbanization, and inequality in Juárez, we combined spatial and historical methodologies, our team. Google Street View and Geographic Information System imagery provided visual evidence of industrialization and investment trends in Juárez. Team members, much more technically gifted than I am, sampled randomly thousands of points on Juárez's modern residential street network. A computer vision model tagged over 10,000 GSV images into 3 categories: impoverished, neutral, or invested. Only images tagged with a greater or equal to 0.85 confidence were considered for this analysis. This spatial data informed our use of more traditional historical sources: government archives, journals, newspapers from the borderlands, censuses, etc. These combined methods demonstrate that Juárez's unique spatial, economic, and political geographies and changes to communal land tenure inform the spatial distribution of urban investment and infrastructure in the city. This, in turn, generated spatial patterns of poverty and gendered violence in ways unseen in other interior Mexican metropolitan regions. Okay, so what do I mean when I say, Juárez's unique geographies? So after the Mexican-American War ended in 1848, with Mexico ceding half of its territory to the United States, the Mexican settlement of El Paso del Norte was split by a new international border, limited by the Rio Grande in the US, Rio Bravo in Mexico. In the north, as you can see, this blue line, and in east, north and east, and mountainous desert to the west. You see these little mountain topography marks. Juárez now occupied vital geographical, political, and economic space, and was the main hub for U.S.-Mexican trade, transportation, and migration beginning in the late 19th century. In 1888, the city was renamed in honor of the former Mexican president and historical benefactor of local agrarian communities, Benito Juárez. All right? In fact, Benito Juárez's 1860s grant of irrigable land to the agricultural community of Senecu to the east of town, the big arrow pointing at Senecu, if you missed it, was vital to the city's future urban expansion. This effectively created an interstitial space between town and country that oriented future urban development eastward and along the river. Senecu, an agricultural village that had existed for centuries in the Valley of Juárez, was officially granted a post-revolutionary Ejidal in 1938. The 1930s are a key period for the Ejidal system, as Lázaro Cárdenas distributed more land than any president before him, part of his radical land reform and nationalization projects in the 30s. However, he paid a political price for this with Mexico's right wing and was forced to shift his radical agenda to the center by the end of his administration in 1940. All right, before I move on, I just want to point out, I don't know if people on the camera can see this, but so not only was Senecu right abutting the river, and this is the Valley of Juárez, but really importantly, I want you to notice Zaragoza, which is also going to be become an Ejidal in the 20th century, and sort of their general relative distance from the original urban core of Juárez. Okay? So this is an old map. I never did find the date, but this is an old map showing that it's still sort of the riparian sort of hinterland. Okay, Senecu. Okay. A major consequence of Mexico's 1940 conservative turn was the escalation of Ejidal land invasion by private interests, migrants, landless peasants, and other ejidatarios in the following decades after World War II. Also, the rapid growth of industrialization, population, and migration in Mexico after 1940 inaugurated a dynamic era of urbanization in Juárez. In the 1960s, the federal government initiated two pivotal programs. The National Border Program, known by its Spanish acronym BRONAF, and the Border Industrialization Program, BIP. These binational development projects sought to increase economic activity in the borderlands by attracting foreign, often U.S. investment. BRONAF prioritized infrastructure and services near ports of entry in order to attract U.S. investors and tourist dollars. BIP, unique to the northern Mexican borderlands, created a free trade zone that enticed foreign manufacturers to relocate to industrial parks in the borderlands. BIP was conceived as a solution to the 1964 termination of the Bracero program, the binational guest worker agreement, which had encouraged millions of campesinos, rural Mexicans, most from western Mexico and many undocumented, to migrate to the U.S. for work. The idea was that former braceros, amassed on Mexico's northern border, would get jobs in domestic infrastructure projects and U.S.-owned factories, maquiladoras. Despite BIF and BRONAF's intent, however, Juárez's industrial workforce was soon dominated by women. This reflected two major national trends during the mid-60s: rising rates of domestic female migration and the feminization of low-wage labor, which was due in large part to continued mass undocumented male migration to the United States. Now, what piqued our interest in the Ejidal lands of Ciudad Juárez, the capital of northern Mexico's borderlands, was previous research we had done in Guadalajara, the capital of western Mexico, and the epicenter of post-war rural migration. According to the existing scholarship, the historiography, Ejidal urbanization in Mexico followed a typical pattern. Peri-urban ejidos, so ejidos located on a city's periphery, were often the sites of informal settlement, rapid and chaotic urbanization, and a lack of infrastructure and investment in the decades following Mexico's 1960 urban turn. Beginning in the 70s, these inalienable yet invaded Ejidal lands were increasingly expropriated by the state to legalize essentially, existing migrant settlements and to facilitate new public works projects. Frequently, this resulted in the creation of peri-urban landscapes characterized by impoverishment and sprawl. This informal urbanization and privatization process circumvented the Ejidos' protected legal status and constitutional status. Our findings in Guadalajara, published in the journal Land, were generally in line with the historiography. There, the mapping of impoverished GSV tags, so these tags the system marked as impoverished due to the scenes that we'll get into in a bit. Impoverished GSV tags revealed that peri-urban Ejidal lands were sites of informal development, chaotic urbanization, divestment, and poverty. The federal government's response in Guadalajara and other interior metro areas like Santiago de Querétaro in the state of Querétaro and Puebla in the state of Puebla was to regularize informal housing settlements established by migrants on Ejidal lands via expropriation, eminent domain, beginning in the 70s. GSV images of Guadalajara reveal the results of expropriating informally settled peri-urban Ejidal lands. You can see on the periphery of the city, kind of almost concentrically, clusters of distressed urban landscapes, lack of investment and impoverishment that ring it, sort of showing successive waves of invasion. The green is the Ejidal lands, the Ejidal boundaries of the existing Ejidos. Now, mind you, some of this land that is no longer in the green was Ejidal land. It was regularized. Okay? So you see that sort of, not circles, but you see it's on the margins of Guadalajara. While the evolution of Ejidal lands in Juárez paralleled many trends in interior Mexican cities like Guadalajara and Querétaro, the urbanization of communal lands in the borderlands diverged in key ways. GSV imagery illustrates that former and current peri-urban Ejidal lands in Juárez often demonstrate high levels of investment, infrastructure, and planning. These images, cropped for privacy purposes, show various locations around the city. Image 1 shows a residential location in the city's formerly peri-urban agricultural eastern sector, near the former Ejido lands of Zaragoza. Image 2 shows another location in the city's eastern sector, a public intersection located on lands comprising or abutting the former Ejido of Senecu. These images portray invested scenes, paved roads and sidewalks, utilities, formal planning. Conversely, images 3 and 4 depict landscapes of varying levels of impoverishment, unpaved or crumbling sidewalks and roads, vacant lots, graffiti, and a lack of privacy. These images were taken from non-Ejido lands in Juárez's western sector, particularly the city's historic center and current southwest. Uniquely, former and current Ejido lands within Juárez's urban borders, unlike interior Mexican cities, are composed of or adjacent to industrial parks containing maquiladoras. Also, peri-urban Ejidos in Juárez were less often the sites of regularized informal settlements and poverty after 1960. To the contrary, visual and traditional sources reveal that Juárez's Ejido lands were often encroached upon for the benefit of private, often foreign industry, as well as private, often residential subdivisions, featuring high levels of infrastructure and investment. So the question would be to a scholar or historian is, why is this deviation, right, from the model? It became apparent that the evolution of post-war Ejido land use in Juárez represented a divergent process of urbanization and industrialization distinct to the northern Mexican borderlands. Like in most of Mexico, urban planning in Juárez was dictated by mayors whose power resided in city councils, dominated often by a single party, often the PRI, where land investors formed networks with politicians. Moreover, local political bosses, land developers, and businessmen were often the same people, with close ties to Mexican heads of state and U.S. industrialists. However, a regime of development via private initiative and by national free trade, encouraged by the state and predicated in part on the privatization of Ejido lands and waters, emerged in Juárez. The unique space inhabited by Ejidos like Senecu, situated between an international border and the boundaries of a growing metropolis, made them prime locations for U.S.-focused trade in the eyes of Juárez's industrialists. These empresarios knew that industry required infrastructure, land, and water, and that arid northern Chihuahua possessed little water or infrastructure. Juárez's peri-urban Ejidos, with their legally tenuous public lands and waters, represented ideal candidates for private industrial development. The pivotal role of communal lands in Juárez's urbanization and industrialization regime is embodied by Senecu, an ancient settlement in a post-revolutionary Ejido that no longer exists. Senecu was located in Juárez's eastern sector along the Rio Bravo, on whose waters it depended. So you see there's the outline of the Juárez in black of the urban core, the original part of the city, and roughly the darker green, or is that teal? I don't know, is the rough boundaries of the Ejido of Senecu, okay? Which used to be in the sort of the rural hinterland of Juárez. So Senecu's produce was essential to the growth of the actual city of Juárez. Despite its key agrarian past, Senecu became the first Ejido in Mexico to wholly privatize after 1990's neoliberal reforms. Thus, the fate of Senecu's communal lands, as well as the Ejido's ultimate dissolution, is revelatory. The persons most responsible for the establishment of the regime that led to Senecu's dissolution were local PRI politicians, landowners, and businessmen, Antonio J. Bermudez and his nephew, Jaime Bermudez Cuaron. So, Antonio J. Bermudez, born in the city of Chihuahua, he moved to Juárez during the Revolution and became wealthy smuggling liquor during Prohibition in the United States. As a bootlegger, nobody knew the city's socioeconomic and physical geographies better than he. Bermudez cemented his position among the city's social and political elite by marrying into the pre-revolutionary landed class and buying part of an infamous hacienda. Bermudez served as municipal president of Juárez in 1942 and 1943 during that pivotal World War II period. His influence in the PRI led to political appointments at the state and federal level, ambassadorships to Middle Eastern countries, and the directorship of Pemex, the state-run oil company. Most importantly, he was named PRONAF director in 1961. Yet it was his nephew, Jaime Bermudez, who transformed development in Juárez by establishing Mexico's first private industrial park. The creation of the Antonio J. Bermudez Industrial Park in 1968 was a watershed in the industrialization of Juárez, the evolution of Ejidal lands, and the spatial distribution of urban inequality. Jaime Bermudez, one of a dozen local businessmen who founded the Antonio J. Bermudez Industrial Park, was born into a prominent family that owned a cotton farm in the Valley of Juárez. Jaime saw a tremendous opportunity to increase the value of his family's holdings when his uncle was named PRONAF director. In fact, he and other local business leaders lobbied the elder Bermudez to support an industrialization study, which was instrumental to the passage of BIP. The implementation of BIP and new tax structures provided crucial incentives for U.S. companies to relocate to Juárez. And as a U.S. educated engineer and modernist, known somewhat derisively sometimes in Mexico as technocrats, Jaime had connections to U.S. business and industry. As a leading BIP booster, Jaime traveled across the United States to attract companies to Juárez. Jaime's first U.S. client arrived in 1967, and the following year, Jaime broke ground on the city's and nation's first private industrial park. This Maquila Industrial Park was promoted as the development model for not only Juárez, but other borderlands cities. Yet the Antonio J. Bermudez Industrial Park occupied lands and used waters that legally belonged to the Ejido of Senecu and therefore the Mexican people. Técnicos were key in calling for the integration of international markets and erasing of international borders, particularly starting in the 50s. Chief among the proponents of globalization was Carlos Lasso, you can see on your screen. He was a leading technical and PRI official whose brand of high modernism was heavily influenced by trips to the US-Mexico borderlands. Lazo decried what he saw as the exportation of vice and labor from the northern Mexican borderlands to the United States. He attributed these social ills primarily to a lack of infrastructure in the region. He called on the nation's engineers to develop the borderlands built environment and integrate it with that of the southern United States. His vision, as well as his key role as Mexico's Secretary of Communications and Public Works from 1952 to 1955, planted the seeds for PRONAF, BIP, and private industrial parks in Juárez. So the origins of the Antonio J. Bermudez Industrial Park can be traced to this period, the mid-50s, a turning point in the urbanization of Juárez. The city was a vital proving ground for Mexican modernism due to the dynamic political, economic, and physical space it inhabited. Senecu's Ejidal lands and waters began the process of informal privatization in 1955 via the construction of a private, upscale neighborhood subdivision, Club Campestre de Ciudad Juárez, the Juárez Country Club. As you can see, Club Campestre is located on the margins of Senecu. Juárez's planners began the expansion of the road network connecting the city's historic urban core, again you can see it in black, with its eastern hinterland due to this Club Campestre project. In mid-1956, city officials announced that Vicente Guerrero, a major city road, would be extended to the east. This slide, which uses Juárez's modern street grid, illustrates Vicente Guerrero's location and role in the historical expansion of the city's boundaries. So in that light shaded area, that's the road Vicente Guerrero, heading towards the east. Juárez's eastward growth at mid-century, symbolized by the construction of private subdivisions and underwritten by public resources and infrastructure investment, betrayed an incipient process of urbanization in peri-urban Ejidal lands that was not haphazard. In fact, urban planners in Juárez, under the guidance and patronage of local officials and businessmen like the Bermudez family, followed official regulatory plans proposed in 1958 and 1962. These officials' plans' main goal was formal, planned growth towards the city's agrarian and riparian eastern outskirts. Public road construction, key to industrialization and urbanization, represented an economic windfall for private construction firms. In fact, one local construction firm, known by its acronym CUNSA, was owned by Antonio Bermudez himself. With Pronath and BIP encouraging rapid industrialization and free trade by the mid-60s, the city's economic and political elites rushed to acquire eastern rural land for development, speeding urbanization. Once rural land was acquired, local, state, and national politicians, many of them investors themselves, provided generous incentives and resources, especially water, to private manufacturers, industrial park owners, and subdivisions. The establishment of the privately owned Antonio J. Bermudez Industrial Park, in part on communal lands, represented a key inflection point in the urbanization of the Valley of Juárez. Following the park's opening in 1968, more foreign, mostly U.S. companies relocated to the city, and the maquila industry thrived. 5 new maquilas were added to the Bermudez Industrial Park in its first 2 years. In 1972, a 125 million peso expansion helped accommodate 30 more maquilas. The growth of the Bermudez Industrial Park and Juárez maquiladora industry continued throughout the 70s. Mexican debt default and peso devaluation in the 80s and resulting cuts to government spending and the social safety net made cheap Mexican labor even more attractive to U.S. companies, further galvanizing the industry. By 1985, Juárez was home to 7 industrial parks. Between 1982 and 1987, the number of maquilas in the city doubled, while their number of employees tripled. While Juárez's private sector reaped the benefits of industrial and economic growth, peri-urban Ejidos faced mounting environmental and resource disparities. Water, vital to both farm and maquila, was distributed more inequitably after 1965. Beginning in the mid-60s, city officials, often private investors themselves, created wells to ensure maquilas access to water. Post-war urbanization and privatization trends saw agriculturalists throughout the northern Mexican borderlands compete with cities in zero-sum contests for water, which encouraged the rapid proliferation of wells and pumps extracting groundwater. As water in Juárez transitioned in earnest from a public to private and rural to urban resource by the late 70s, expanded groundwater pumping increased the salinity of the irrigation water Ejidos depended on. Also, new private subdivisions exacerbated Ejidos' water woes. By the late 80s, for example, some neighborhoods in Senecu's periphery had converted ditches into dumps, contaminating the water supply of Senecu, as well as other rural and agricultural communities in the region. As environmental ills and resource inequality increasingly threatened Ejidarios' lands and their livelihoods, Juárez's farms struggled to attract seasonal labor due to mass migration to the United States. This phenomenon had intensified after the passage of BIP. Rural male laborers, accustomed to working in large numbers in the United States for relatively higher wages, since World War II, preferred U.S. jobs due to their relatively higher wages and for the reasons I just mentioned. Throughout the 70s and 80s, male migrants used Juárez primarily as a temporary stopover on their U.S. labor journeys. And although maquila jobs were an option in theory for the largely male pool of U.S. labor migrants, maquila employers preferred to hire young, single, and childless women who were perceived to be more submissive. The urbanization of Juárez Ejido lands via a development regime that privatized public resources was sanctioned by Mexican officials well before the country's neoliberal turn in the 1990s. For example, in the 1980s, agriculturalists from the Valley of Juárez accused Jaime Bermudez of having illegally invaded 11,000 hectares of their land beginning in the 1960s, all with the consent of Chihuahua's then governor, the priista Oscar Flores Sanchez. A few years later, Flores Sanchez became Mexico's Attorney General, the official most responsible for enforcing national laws at a critical juncture for the Ejido system. Jaime's illicit actions, along with his uncle's self-dealings and the complicity of state and federal officials, exposed the economic boon and relative legal impunity of privatizing Ejido lands, especially in the northern borderlands. These lessons were not lost on the U.S.-educated technocrats who dominated Mexican politics nationally beginning in the 1980s. So President Carlos Salinas, his 1992 Ejidal deregulation merely formalized processes that had occurred throughout Mexico for decades. The trajectory of the Antonio J. Bermudez Industrial Park and the role of maquilas and free trade in Juárez ultimately influenced the official reform of the Ejidal system. The successes of the city's development regime, both real and perceived, in conjunction with dramatic shifts in Mexico's rural economy, provided neoliberal technocrats with the impetus to privatize the Ejidal system, an action once unthinkable. By constructing Juárez in Mexico's first private industrial park on lands belonging to and abutting Cenecu, officials and investors helped erode legal and cultural barriers to occupying and privatizing Ejidal lands. Within 2 years of Salinas' reforms, Cenecu's remaining ejidatarios were granted full individual domain of its parcels. 6 years later, the process to dissolve the Ejidal, it's a very complex structure, so you have to actually dissolve the corporation essentially, was begun by its members. And nearly a decade after early 1990s reforms, Cenecu was fully privatized, marking another national first for Juárez, the complete dissolution of a post-revolutionary Ejidal. Arguably, my talk could stop here, with me concluding sort of on a historiographical level that when compared to the established scholarship on Ejidal urbanization in Mexico, Cenecu's transition from a peri-urban to urban landscape and public to private natural resource, dominated by industrial parks and foreign-owned maquiladoras, underscores the key divergences between Ejidal urbanization in Mexico's northern borderlands and in Mexico's urban interior. I could also conclude that this reflects the broader project of post-war Mexican industrialization, one that prioritized rapid industrialization and globalization over social and resource parity. However, and crucially, the urbanization of Juárez's eastern periphery, predicated in part on Ejidal lands like Cenecu's, as well as segments of other Ejidos like Zaragoza and Salvarcar, informed the spatial distribution of investment in the city after 1960. And despite Carlos Lazo's mid-century modernist vision for the northern Mexican borderlands, investment and infrastructure patterns in Juárez intensified inequality, a trend that is vividly demonstrated by GSV and GIS analysis. Also, these landscapes of unequal infrastructure and investment reveal links to tremendous social ills that plague modern Juárez. Okay, and just so you know, the slides coming up, these Google Street View images are tagged, impoverished, neutral, invested, and so the blue is more invested. The Google Street View images clustered. So blue is more invested, red is less invested, white is more neutral. Okay. So it's that same slide that was on the last slide here. You can still see Cenecu, the sort of former margins of Cenecu there. This is, investment. So what the Google Street View reveals as to be sort of if it is invested or disinvested landscape. And the other slide to the right shows impoverishment, which is census data. So what do people make in that area, okay, as a salary? So GSV and GIS imagery demonstrate that the urbanization of rural and communal lands in the former eastern periphery of Juárez often produce landscapes characterized by high levels of investment, infrastructure, and planning. This is a departure from the typical model of post-1960 Ejidal urbanization in Mexico. As the map on your right demonstrates, the distribution of GSV tags, the map on your left, I should say, demonstrates the distribution of GSV tags, as GSV images tagged as impoverished, largely splits Juárez on a north-south axis, okay, between its more invested eastern half and a more impoverished western half. And the eastern half is the original location of the city's primary peri-urban ejidos, private industrial parks, and private housing subdivisions. And the less invested western half is home to impoverished urban landscapes and informal housing, dominated by the city's historic urban core, that you can see there on the left in black. The high level of investment and planning encountered in formerly peripheral Ejidal lands in Juárez diverges from trends witnessed in Guadalajara. For example, Guadalajara is the nation's Mexico's third largest metropolitan area. As the slide shows, GSV and GIS data provide a revealing portrait of the distribution and concentration of tags characterized as impoverished in both cities. The map on the right shows impoverished, informal landscapes dominating Juárez's urban core, not periphery. Okay, so it's the original urban core is dominated by impoverished landscapes. In particular, the northwest of Juárez is home to the city's historic urban core, urban center, and neighborhoods, colonias in Spanish. So income levels in the western sector also pale in comparison to Juárez's more formally developed eastern sector, which is home to private maquila industrial parks and private subdivisions that occupy and or abut the former and current peri-urban Ejidal lands of Senecu, Salvarcar, and Zaragoza. The distribution of GSV images tagged as impoverished differs markedly in the map of Guadalajara on the left. Impoverished tags cluster exclusively on the urban periphery, the location of the city's former and current peri-urban, communal, and rural lands. The positions of these clusters suggest successive waves of invasion of Ejidal lands by migrants, among others, seeking housing on vulnerable lands, deficient in infrastructure and planning, a process that reflects Mexico's classic Ejidal urbanization model. Guadalajara's historic and, very importantly, geographical center, okay, urban center and surrounding older colonias, do not demonstrate the low levels of infrastructure and investment that characterize Juárez's urban core. Plus, Guadalajara, located in the western Sierra Madre Occidental range in Mexico's interior, was not dominated spatially or politically by an international border serving as the historical entrepot for foreign capital, trade, and industry. As these maps suggest, the evolution of Ejidal lands and ensuing concentration of investment and wealth in Juárez's eastern sector contributed to the concentration of informality and poverty in non-Ejidal lands after 1960. Rather than clustering on the urban periphery like Guadalajara, informal settlements in Juárez grouped nearer the city's core, occupying or abutting the Sierra de Juárez mountains and hills immediately southwest of the historic city center. Since Ejidal and riparian lands in the valley of Juárez were coveted by officials and investors for their manufacturing potential, i.e. access to cheap land and water, the lands most available to poor rural to urban migrants were located mainly in arid mountainous terrain. These informal settlements were populated by workers from the maquila industry, Juárez's largest employer. As you can see from this slide, maquila industrial parks were located disproportionately in the current city's east and center, and correlate with the spatial distribution of investment and poverty. Crucially, the maquila workforce was dominated by women by the 1990s. Gendered poverty and violence were major outcomes of post-1960 industrialization and globalization trends in Juárez. While the process of Ejidal urbanization did not contribute directly to violence against women, GSV and GIS imagery provide unique insight into the evolution of Ejidal land use and ensuing distribution of investment, inequality, and violence in Juárez. In particular, significant correlations emerge when comparing investment and femicide trends in the city. Since femicide is one of the most tangible manifestations of inequality, and violence not only inequality, but violence in late 20th century Mexico, along, of course, with narco-violence, and often intertwined, correct? It is also an act intimately associated with maquila work, poverty, public space, and a lack of investment, and a lack of infrastructure. Because of these factors, it is worth exploring the linkages between urbanization, investment, and femicide patterns here. So, municipal data and GIS imagery demonstrate that gendered poverty and violence were concentrated largely, but not exclusively, to Juárez's western sector. In fact, by the early 2000s, 6 of the city's top 7 key femicide zones, as the study put it, were located in Juárez's northwest and center-west. This map, taken from a municipal study of femicide trends from 1993 to 2010, reveals that the urban spaces where victims' bodies were discovered map closely onto the distributions of impoverishment and income shown earlier. And we'll make that similarity more explicit in here in a little bit. Non-Ejidal lands in Western Juárez provided the bulk of informal housing for migrants and maquila employees. Housing often comprised of cardboard or wood pallet structures. As this slide illustrates, these urban landscapes of poverty and violence were somewhat, maybe to you, ironically, situated far from these original private industrial parks, maquilas and private subdivisions dominating the city's eastern sector. Crucially, access to water and its infrastructure played a principal role in the spatial distribution of invested and impoverished landscapes. In the 50s and 60s, municipal projects that sought to expand water and sewer infrastructure incorporated older communities abutting Juárez's historic center, as well as the more immediate western and southern limits of the urban core. So they were included in these 50s and 60s studies. However, by the early 70s, shifting political, economic, and legal priorities led to the rapid expansion of maquilas and industrial parks in Juárez's east. These private industrial parks and private subdivisions eventually dominated public water resources and infrastructure investment. By the late 70s, subdivisions in Juárez's formerly rural, agricultural northeast were fully modernized. In the meantime, flows of migrants from the Mexican interior swelled Juárez's informal settlements on lands lacking water and infrastructure, located largely in the western sector of Juárez. By the 1990s, female migrants, most of them low-wage industrial laborers or domestic servants, had overwhelmed these settlements. So also, back to road infrastructure. Road infrastructure, like that of water, reflected the duality of Juárez's built environment. Maquila workers, typically poor females, commuted long distances on foot from their colonias, often western slums, lacking running water and basic services. Once in the city center, they boarded company buses that delivered them to industrial parks in Juárez's eastern and central sort of sector. This daily trek, frequently undertaken alone and at night along dirt roads lacking streetlights and police, could be dangerous and deadly. During the 90s, for example, I'm sure many of you know and have read, bus drivers were charged with using their vehicles and knowledge of the city's informal road networks to prey on young women traveling to and from work alone. These serial murders were the most tangible manifestation of a stark correlation between the location of femicide crime scenes and Juárez roads. From 1993 to 2010, nearly a third of all femicide victims' bodies were discovered on the city's less invested, more informal, less secure western roadways. Okay, this is the slide 2. So again, this is distribution of investment, distribution of income, which shows poverty levels, and sort of the heat map of where bodies of femicide victims were discovered in Juárez. Okay? So GSV, GIS and municipal data demonstrate that where a woman lived and died correlated robustly with Juárez's disparate landscapes of investment and income. An intimate connection existed between a victim's residence and the location where her body was discovered. And from 1993 to 2010, nearly half of all victims' bodies were encountered in vacant lots. Where a woman lived and where her body was recovered were intrinsically linked to poor and divested, often public spaces. These factors converge regularly in Juárez's west. Contrast these vacant lots, poor and unlit roads, public spaces, informal housing, and lack of services with Juárez's more invested, planned, private, and generally wealthier eastern sector, home to most of the city's maquilas. Okay, you see the kind of darkish more red means there's more income levels in the areas where these industrial parks are, sort of counterintuitively. Researchers have observed that Juárez's maquila industrial parks, featuring fewer public spaces, more robust planning and infrastructure, and ample access to water, were, by the 2000s, quote, more often located in formerly developed areas inhabited by a more affluent populace, end quote. These more private, secure, and wealthy landscapes were forged in part from former communal lands of Senecu, Zaragoza, and Salvacar. While the causes of femicide are far too complex to discuss here, GSV and GIS data provide a fresh perspective on the correlations between urbanization and violence in Juárez. Visual imagery reveals how the evolution of the city's peri-urban ejidos contributed to distinct and disparate patterns of investment and income. This process informed the distribution of inequality, which forged two spatially and economically distinct cities by the 1980s, one more industrial, private, and invested in the east, and the other more informal, public, and impoverished in the west. By the 80s and the 90s, financial crises and neoliberal reforms intensified poverty and violence in Juárez, resulting in hundreds of women being officially identified as murder victims from 1993 to 1999. And in 1999, the city was home to 330 mostly US-owned maquilas. To summarize, both visual imagery and conventional sources reveal a process of ejido urbanization in the northern Mexican borderlands that diverged from the classic model observed in interior Mexican regions of Mexico. Furthermore, this methodology illustrates that the key role of private industrial parks and multinational maquilas in the evolution of communal land tenure in Juárez, as well as the official deregulation of Mexico's ejido system. Two trends that intensified in the 1970s and reached their zenith in the 1990s. The process of ejido urbanization, shaped by the unique political, economic, and physical geographies of Juárez, influenced the spatial distribution and concentration of investment, inequality, and gendered violence in the city. Regional variations in ejido urbanization, particularly the lower incidences of informal housing and impoverished landscapes in peri-urban and urban, former and current ejido lands in Juárez, suggest that the processes of ejido urbanization in Mexico are more diverse than previously thought, and that further research on urbanization in the northern Mexican borderlands, particularly the city of Tijuana, another sort of model of the borderlands city of Mexico, is necessary. Thank you for your time and attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Mateo. Maybe if you can stay up there. And are you happy fielding questions?
Sure.
Excellent. So let's turn things over to our audience with questions.
Sure.
That was such a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I'm wondering, so I know that in the 1980s, 90s, there was a big influx of migrants from the more southern states into these colonias like Anapra and all these places in the west. And I'm wondering, was there also a correlation between the, end of the ejido land system and people losing their ability to practice that livelihood, or cultivate public lands? Were those also, how big of a percentage of people moving to the colonias do you think would have been people affected by the ejido land system changes in other parts of Mexico?
Oh, that's a question I don't think I have the expertise in, but I don't know the numbers of, you mean from Oaxaca or Chiapas, from indigenous parts of Mexico? I don't know those statistics, but it's I would only be conjecture, and I don't want to do that. I apologize. Yeah. Sure.
But more than a question, it's just a comment. I grew up, I was born in Zaragoza, in the Ejido de Zaragoza, and I grew up in South Sal. And it's only the second time that I have seen South Sal in a map.
Okay, you want to go back to that?
The other one was a map, a Russian map of the area. Obviously, the Russians were espiando at the height of the Cold War. And so it's so gratifying for me to see my town in Russian, in a Russian map, and see it over here. And it just gave context to all of these terms that I heard growing up. PRONAF, the Programa Nacional Fronterizo, Bermúdez, Antonio J. Bermúdez, J. Bermúdez, Senecu, Salvarcar, all these places. And I just remember taking the bus from my father's ejido. I was the heir to the ejido in South Sal, in an almost mythical ride, Digno de Garcia Marquez or Juan Rulfo, and Transportes Valle de Juárez that went from Porvenir, another mythical name, to Ciudad Juárez. And I don't know how long the ride took, but it almost feels like getting in the train riding Juan Jose Arriola, where you just never reach your destination. And growing up, I was just curious, what does Porvenir look like? Until I realized, oh, Porvenir. El porvenir is the future that you just never get there. So thank you for that moment of nostalgia. La nostalgia traiciona. I got over my nostalgia in 30 seconds.
Yeah, no, this map was great. It's you know, it's funny. So this research was done. So the beauty of sort of using GSV data and sort of online data stuff, electronic data, is that this project was you know, done during the pandemic, so we could do it from our desks. Like, there were so many questions, you know, raised during this that you would love to go to an archive for, but it's like, we can't go, and you know, we can't go this and that. So it's like, you can still, I guess this is just a lesson for the master's students, like, you can still, you know, have, you know, historical questions that can be answered if you can't get to sort of documents. And I forget where I found this, but this was great. Yeah, like, I didn't have a date, but definitely a historical representation of the old Juárez, where sort of these more footpaths to Senecu, and not necessarily street grids, and it looks like to your town and your, you know, odyssey to get to the city of Juárez. So yeah, no, that's, you know, you make do with what you have, I guess, is one of the lessons that we can learn from this project. But yeah, thank you for the observation, Adan.
I think the towns were 10 kilometers apart.
Planned.
And the names are just mythical. Tres Jacales, there were Tres Jacales. Loma Blanca, La Colorada. And it's like, where are these names coming from?
Well,
I really love the presentation, I love particularly the GSV map that's so telling, showing the east and west. Something that I thought was interesting, as you see the development in the eastern parts, you see the club capacity that you mentioned. But then at the same time, you have this industrial park right next to it. And in my mind, when I picture an industrial zone, industrial area, I don't picture a particularly affluent area.
Exactly. Yeah, most towns, you think the industrial area is like the rundown town, you avoid it, it's the dirty, it's like where the poor people are forced to live, right?
Yeah, more isolated. So I was just trying to understand, you know, how it correlates, like, you know, there being like these affluent neighborhoods next to like these factories, these industries.
It's just, you know, it goes back to sort of the talk. It's the available land that has very crucial water because it's right by the river. So you know, it's plentiful land, but you need water for maquilas. You need water for subdivisions, as we're learning now, right, with our own limited resources as we continue to build in California and the United States. And I think the third sort of, so it's not only just cheap land, cheap water, but I think the third prong is the vulnerability of Ejidal lands. That are protected in theory, but not necessarily in practice. There's plenty of examples throughout Mexican history. Early on, the Ejidal lands being encroached upon, being you know, informally privatized. All right, and it's because of this that Mexico, this President Salinas, actually leads, you know, signs the deregulation into law because it's already something that's been happening. So yeah, I think that's why, you know, it's hard to answer. It's sort of the magic of the borderlands. It's like it's this land that is such a crucial geography, politically, economically, sort of socially, culturally. As to why I don't want to glorify it and say like it's so unique, because that's why I think you need to study like Tijuana. Is something similar happening in Tijuana, or is this the outlier? You know what I'm saying? As opposed to, because in other parts of interior Mexico, we did some study, you know, Guadalajara, the paper that is still waiting to get feedback from the publisher. I included a bit on Querétaro, there's Puebla, there's this robust sort of literature that shows that the former Ejidal lands and sort of the periphery are always sort of often informal, you know, impoverished. And they do have a lot of the factories and stuff, but it's not like, it doesn't have like these subdivisions that also come along with the water and the cheaper land and this sort of land rush. I don't know if that answers your question, but I definitely think it's due. If more research needs to be done before you can really extrapolate, but it is definitely the unique character of this region. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I think we want to at least get in a question from the online.
From the screen.
So from the online audience, I do want to make this question that comes from Michael Wolf. He first is very happy to see you on our same old stomping grounds, but he says, and I do want to also mention, by the way, Sara Clemente has been doing an incredible job at moving back and forth for the online version of this, so people have been seeing the maps and have been able to appreciate all the incredible work you do. So would you know whether the Senecu Ejido got entangled in US-Mexico water disputes over the Rio Bravo and the shared aquifer that ignored national borders?
Okay, well, hi Mikael. To answer that question, so here's the deal. So it's a great question, Mikael, and the issue with Senecu, and it goes back to what I just mentioned about pandemic and pandemic research, is that was so little information on Senecu. I worked with a grad student, Jonathan Perez, on this paper, and we had to piece together let me get there for you. We had to piece together from newspaper articles. Hold on. Where are we here? We had to piece together from newspaper articles and other sort of ephemera the actual rough boundaries of Senecu. And this is a great example of where you would love to go to the actual archive in Juárez, even probably El Paso if you could. But information was very hard to find. So this was a rough estimation of the Ejido Senecu. So knowing that, the questions about his very specific questions about land disputes and water disputes, the short answer is no. I don't know much about the water disputes with Senecu. Of course, if this is also, just so you know, this project was great because I was able to incorporate a lot of my research interests, but it's not a focus of my research. I mean, as Zephyr so nicely explained my research before, I have a lot of different interests in built environment, natural environment. It's also an example for the MA students of how you can take sort of a different topic and work in what you're interested in. So, because I worked in built environment, natural environment, migration, into a project that is essentially urban studies and urbanization and Ejidal sort of communal studies. So all that to say is I'm not an expert on the water situation in Juárez, but I would have loved to many times in this process to go to see some. We know there's archives, and oftentimes, Juárez has what is it, IMIP? It's municipal sort of. It has very decent archives, and it creates a lot of really great sort of statistical and mapping itself. Like some of these maps were from the municipal authority, but all that's to say, I do not know about water disputes in Senecu. Apologies.
Maybe one more we bring, and then we have to cut the broadcast because. Well,
thank you so much. That was so interesting, and I thought it was very intriguing how matters of social justice and environmental justice are both reflected in the space of the city. So that is, of course, Ejidos, but also water issues and so on. So I was wondering if you were aware of any initiatives in urban planning that seek to remedy these problems that are kind of inherent in the spatial organization of the city.
That's a great question. And again, I refer back to, I am not 100% an expert in Juárez and its water issues. My expertise lies, as you can probably gained a little bit of a hint, in Guadalajara and Western Mexico and migration and built environment and natural environment there. But I do, to your point though, I think inequality, natural resources. I've learned in my sort of scholarly sort of trajectory in that you can't, wherever there's inequality, there's bound to be disparity in natural resources. All right, land, water, access to whatever. So, but all that to say, I don't know of any initiatives, water initiatives. I guess that's what I heard. Somebody here was working on Juárez and femicide. Oh, okay. But maybe that's something for you all to look into. But I can't answer your question more directly. I apologize, but nothing specific for Juárez specific or river specific.
Okay.
So maybe just give me the
Easy.
paper for a second. So we need to finish the broadcast part of our session today. We will continue a little bit the conversation here in-house with Matteo. What I do want to, before I thank Matteo again, is please join us next Friday on the 27th with Professor Mirna Santiago, who's going to be speaking about empire and natural disasters, the 1931 earthquake and American occupation of Nicaragua. So thank you so much, Matteo, and thank you all of you.
I can walk up. Okay. Just making sure.
Yeah. Okay.